Hey guy, may I ask you a question?
Sir.
Hey guy, why have you got a pet chain chomp?
The reason why I got an pet chain chomp is because I needed it for assistance to defeat the Mario Brothers.
What Helium is named after?
The Greek word, Helios, which means sun, our star.
What about lithium?
The Greek word, lithos, which means stone.
What about boron?
An Arabic word, barak.
What about carbon?
A Latin word, carbo, which means charcoal, or coal. Either way it's fine.
What about fluorine?
A Latin word, fluoros, which means to flow.
What about neon?
The Greek word, neos, which means new.
What about sodium?
An English word, soda, which is a kind of drink.
What about magnesium?
A district of Greece. Magnesia.
What about aluminum?
A Latin word, aluminos, which means bitter salt.
What about silicon?
A Latin word, silicos, which means flint.
What about phosphorus?
The Greek word, phosphoros, which means carrying light, or bearer of light. Either one of them it's okay.
What about sulfur?
A Latin word, sulfur, which means brimstone.
What about chlorine?
The Greek word, chlorus, which means yellow-green, which is a color of the spectrum.
What about argon?
The Greek word, argos, which means idol.
What about potassium?
An English word, potash, and compound of potassium.
What about calcium?
A Latin word, car, which means lime, which is a fruit.
What about scandium?
A Latin word, Scandia, which means Scandinavia, and location consists of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland.
What about chromium?
The Greek word, chroma, which means color.
What about manganese?
A Latin word, magnus, which refers to Magnus, or in case, a Polish word, magnus, which means magnet.
What about cobalt?
A German word, kobold, which means goblin.
What about copper?
A Latin word, kyprios, which means cypress.
What about gallium?
A Latin word, gallia, which means gall.
What about germanium?
A Latin word, Germania, which means Germany.
What about arsenic?
The Greek word, arsenikos, which means orpiment.
What about selenium?
Take Greek word, selene, which means moon, our planet's neighbor.
What about bromine?
The Greek word, bromos, which means stench.
What about krypton?
The Greek word, kryptos, which means hidden.
What about rubidium?
The Greek word, rubidios, which means deepest red.
What about strontium?
A village in Scotland, Strontian.
What about yttrium? Terbium? Erbium? Ytterbium?
They're all named after a village in Sweden, Ytterby.
What about zirconium?
An Arabic word, zircon, which means gold-colored.
What about molybdenum?
The Greek word, melibgos, which means lead.
What about technetium?
The Greek word, technetios, which means artificial.
What about ruthenium?
A Latin word, Ruthenia, which means Russia, the biggest country in Eurasia and our world.
What about rhodium?
The Greek word, rhodos, which means rose.
What about palladium?
The second asteroid discovered in March 2, 1802 named Pallas.
What about cadmium?
A Latin word, cadmia, which means calamine, an old zinc or mineral.
What about indium?
A Latin word, indicum, which means indigo, the color of the spectrum.
What about antimony?
The Greek words, antimonos, which means against one, or not alone. Either one it's fine but it still works.
What about tellurium?
A Latin word, which means Earth, our planet and the third planet of the solar system.
What about iodine?
The Greek word, iodos, which means violet, the color that is the shade of purple.
What about xenon?
The Greek word, xenos, which means stranger, or strange. Either one of them it's okay but it still works.
What about cesium?
A Latin word, cesios, which means sky blue, a shade of blue.
What about barium?
The Greek word, barios, which means heavy.
What about lanthanum?
The Gaelic word, lanthanos, which means lie hidden.
What about cerium?
The first asteroid discovered in 1801, Sears.
What about praseodymium?
The Greek word presios didymos, which means green twin.
What about neodymium?
The Greek words, neos didymos, which means new twin.
What about samarium?
A minor, smarskite.
What about europium?
The sixth largest continent in the world behind Asia, Europe.
What about gadolinium?
Unfinished chemist who lived from June 5, 1760 to August 15, 1852, Johann Gadolin.
What about holmium?
A Latin word, holmia, which means Stockholm, the capital of Sweden.
What about lutetium?
A Latin word, Lutetia, which means Paris, the capital of France.
What about hafnium?
A Latin word, Hafnia, which means Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark.
What about rhenium?
The river, Rhine.
What about osmium?
The Greek word, osmos, which means odor, or smell. One of them is fine.
What about platinum?
The Spanish word, platina, which means little silver.
What about mercury?
The first planet in our solar system, Mercury.
What about thallium?
The Greek word, thalios, which means green twig.
What about bismuth?
The German word, Bismuth, which means white mass.
What about polonium?
A Latin word, Polonia, which means Poland.
What about astatine?
The Greek word, astatinos, which means unstable.
What about francium?
A Latin word, Francia, which means France.
What about radium? Actinium?
Radium is named after the Latin word, radios, same meaning for actinium, but it's named after the Greek word, actinios, which means beam, or ray. Either one of them it's okay.
What about uranium?
The seventh and coldest planet in our solar system, Uranus.
What about neptunium?
The eighth planet in our solar system, Neptune.
What about plutonium?
The ninth planet in our solar system, Pluto.
What about americium?
The country of North America, America.
What about curium?
Both Polish physicists, Marie and Pierre Curie.
What about berkelium?
The city in California, Berkeley.
What about californium?
The U.S. state of California.
What about einsteinium?
The German physicist that lived from March 14, 1879 to April 18, 1955, Albert Einstein.
What about fermium?
The Italian-American physicist who lived from September 29, 1901 to November 28, 1954, Enrico Fermi.
What about mendelevium?
A Russian chemist and the creator of the periodic table who lived from February 8, 1834 to February 2, 1907, Dmitry Mendeleev.
What about nobelium?
A Swedish chemist, engineer, inventor, businessman who lived to October 21, 1833 to December 10, 1896, Alfred Nobel.
What about lawrencium?
An American nuclear scientist who lived from August 8, 1901 to August 27, 1958, Ernest O. Lawrence.
What about rutherfordium?
A New Zealand-British physicist who lived from August 30, 1871 to October 19, 1937, Ernest Rutherford.
What about dubnium?
An state in Russia, Dubna.
What about seaborgium?
An American chemist who lived from April 19, 1912 to February 25, 1999, Glenn Theodore Seaborg.
What about borium?
And Danish physicist who lived from October 7, 1885 to November 18, 1962, Niels Henrik David Bohr.
What about hassium?
A state of Germany, Hesse.
What about meitnerium?
An Austrian-Swedish physicist who lived from November 7, 1878 to October 27, 1968, Lisa Meitner.
What about darmstadtium?
A city in Germany, Darmstadt.
What about röntgenium?
A German mechanical engineer physicist who lived from March 27, 1845 to February 10, 1923, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen.
What about copernicium?
An Renaissance-era mathematician and astronomer who lived from February 19, 1473 to May 21, 1543 and published the theory that the planets revolve around the Sun, Nicholas Copernicus.
What about mehonium?
The Japanese word, Nihon, which means Japan, an island in Eastern Asia.
What about flerovium?
An Russian physicist who lived from March 2, 1913 to November 19, 1990, Georgy Nikolaevich Flyarov.
What about moscovium?
The capital of Russia, Moscow.
What about livermorium?
The town in California, Livermore.
What about tennessein?
The U.S. state of Tennessee.
What about oganesson?
An Russian physicist who was born in April 14, 1933 and the discovery of the superheavy elements, Yuri Tslukhovich Oganessian.
Okay,